The thing got out. I need to see your identification. Right now.
For what reason, officer? I haven't done anything.
Answer your papers.
I am a university professor.
Reasonable suspicion. Stop playing lawyer. You're detaining yourself. ID. Now.
Am I being detained or am I free to go? Answer the question.
You're not going anywhere until I know who you are.
The camera is already recording when the demand is made. There is no preface, no explanation offered on the footage, just an officer asserting control and asking for papers. At that moment, nothing outward appears extraordinary. A request is issued, a pause follows. What the camera does not know yet is what the audience already does. This encounter will later be measured not in minutes, but in millions of dollars. The woman standing in front of the officer is a university professor. That fact is not introduced through credentials or biography, it is established through action. According to publicly available records tied to her role, she has spent years operating inside systems that evaluate rules, interpret institutional authority, and assess whether procedures align with governing standards. She works within environments where compliance is documented, reviewed, and challenged through formal process. None of that is visible to the officer making the demand. The first decision point occurs when the officer chooses to escalate from observation to compulsion. Rather than clarifying the legal basis for the request, the demand for papers is repeated. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed. There is no indication on the footage that a crime has been articulated. No clear statement of reasonable suspicion is audible. The camera records only posture, distance, and tone. The professor does not flee. She does not interfere. She remains present. The officer, however, commits to a course of action that assumes authority without documenting its foundation. This was another chance to pause. It was not taken. The dramatic irony is already in place. The audience knows that this exchange will end in a $12.8 million lawsuit victory. The officer does not. On camera, the encounter still appears recoverable. The officer could explain the basis for the demand, he could de-escalate, he could disengage. Each of those options remains available, briefly. Instead, the insistence continues. The decision to persist without recalibration removes another lawful exit. According to the footage, the interaction shifts from inquiry to enforcement without a recorded justification. That transition matters. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not chosen. The setting itself contributes to the imbalance. The professor is from Texas, a jurisdiction where constitutional limits on detention and identification requests are well established in public case law. The officer's demand now operates inside that legal environment, whether acknowledged or not. The camera captures the moment when institutional authority is asserted without aligning itself to those constraints. What makes this opening sequence compelling is not volume or confrontation. It is restraint. The professor's conduct remains controlled. The officer's options continue to narrow. Each second recorded increases the weight of what will later be reviewed frame by frame. The commitment is now locked in. This is no longer a routine request. It is the first documented step in a chain of decisions that will be examined by supervisors, internal reviewers, and city attorneys. The footage will not change. The interpretation of it will. The legitimacy of the professor's presence is not established through argument. It is established through absence. Specifically, the absence of anything on the footage that would lawfully justify the demand being made. The camera records no warning, no violation articulated, no description of conduct that would elevate the interaction beyond a consensual encounter. What remains is a person standing in place and an officer insisting on documentation without recording why. This is where the second layer of the case takes form. Legitimacy is not a claim asserted by the subject. It is a condition evaluated by law. According to widely applied Fourth Amendment standards, a demand for identification requires more than curiosity or discomfort. It requires a clearly stated, articulable basis tied to observable facts. The footage does not show that threshold being met. The next decision point arrives quietly. The officer chooses not to clarify the legal basis for the demand. Instead, he repeats it. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed again. The professor remains compliant in posture and tone. She does not obstruct the officer's movement. She does not interfere with equipment. She does not attempt to leave the frame. The absence of resistance matters because it removes one of the most common justifications later cited in detention reviews. This decision removed another potential defense before it was ever available. What the officer perceives and what the law recognizes now begin to diverge. Perception is subjective. Legitimacy is not. The officer's continued insistence transforms the encounter from a momentary inquiry into a de facto detention. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not taken. The camera captures a subtle shift. The space between the officer and the professor closes. The tone becomes directive rather than inquisitive. These details are not emotional cues. They are legal ones. Courts evaluate distance, positioning, and command language when determining whether a reasonable person would feel free to leave. Each of those elements is now moving in a single direction. Another decision point follows. The officer does not disengage. He does not request supervisory input. He does not reframe the interaction as voluntary. Instead, he doubles down on the demand for papers. This decision narrowed the lawful exit further. The professor's legitimacy becomes more pronounced as the interaction continues. She does not produce false information. She does not escalate verbally. Her responses, as captured on the footage, remain measured. In later reviews, this consistency will matter. It removes ambiguity. It leaves fewer variables for interpretation. The setting reinforces this imbalance. Texas law, as reflected in publicly accessible judicial opinions, has long addressed the limits of stop and identify practices. Those limits do not require the subject to argue them in the moment. They apply regardless. The officer's demand now exists within that framework, whether acknowledged on scene or not. Another chance to correct course appears when the professor asks for clarification. This is not defiance. It is a request for legal grounding. The officer declines to provide it. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed again. The legitimacy gap is now fully formed. On one side is an officer acting on assumption. On the other is a subject whose conduct remains within lawful bounds. The camera records the gap widening, not through confrontation, but through persistence. As seconds pass, the encounter accrues evidentiary weight. Each unanswered request for justification strengthens the record that will later be reviewed. Each repeated demand without explanation becomes another data point. This was another chance to stop. It was not taken. The professor's role as a university academic is not invoked as privilege. It functions differently. It explains familiarity with structured authority, procedural review, and institutional accountability. Those environments reward documentation and penalize unsupported assertions. The officer's actions are now being recorded in a way that mirrors those same evaluative systems. The next decision point is procedural. The officer chooses not to disengage despite the absence of escalating behavior. That choice matters. Prolonged detention without articulated cause increases scrutiny exponentially. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not chosen. The legitimacy of the professor's presence remains intact because nothing on the footage undermines it. There is no flight, no concealment, no interference. The law does not require more from her. The burden rests elsewhere now. By the end of this phase, the encounter has shifted irrevocably. What began as a request has become a record. What appeared routine is now preserved for review. The professor's lawful posture remains unchanged. The officer's legal exposure does not. This is the foundation upon which everything that follows will be built. Supervisors will later ask why the demand was made. Reviewers will examine when disengagement was possible. Attorneys will measure each second against constitutional standards. The camera does not answer those questions. It only records who had the chance to ask them and who chose not to. The focus now shifts away from the individual exchange and toward the structure surrounding it. Not motive, not intent, structure. According to standard departmental practice, reflected in public policy manuals across multiple jurisdictions, an officer's actions do not exist in isolation. They operate within a layered system designed to correct, intervene, or halt errors before they compound. The footage shows that system remaining silent. The next decision point does not occur on the street. It occurs in what does not happen next. There is no recorded attempt to consult a supervisor, no radio call requesting guidance, no pause to reassess whether the encounter has drifted beyond its legal footing. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed again. Departments rely on supervision as a pressure release mechanism. When uncertainty arises, escalation upward is meant to preserve legality, not undermine authority. The officer does not use that mechanism. Instead, control is retained at the lowest level, where the consequences of misjudgment are highest. This decision removed another lawful exit. Context matters here, but only in function, not characterization. The officer is operating inside a system that measures outcomes after the fact. Body-worn cameras exist for that reason. They create an objective record that replaces recollection with review. Every action taken on camera assumes a second audience: supervisors, internal affairs investigators, and municipal attorneys. The officer's decisions now speak to that audience, whether intended or not. Another decision point emerges as the encounter continues without change. The officer maintains the demand without narrowing its scope or articulating its basis. That choice has systemic implications. In later reviews, prolonged insistence without justification is often evaluated as a failure of training application rather than momentary oversight. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not taken. The department's role is visible in absence. There is no interruption, no override. No policy safeguard engages in real time. The encounter continues as if unobserved, even though it is being recorded in high definition. That contradiction will matter later. Internal accountability systems are designed to identify exactly this pattern: repeated decisions that increase exposure while offering diminishing returns. Each additional second of unsupported enforcement increases risk without adding clarity. The officer's continued commitment to the demand reflects a common institutional failure mode, doubling down in the absence of feedback. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed further. The professor's conduct remains unchanged. This constancy simplifies later analysis. Review bodies look for volatility when assessing responsibility. Here, there is none from the subject. All variability comes from the officer's choices. That imbalance shifts evaluative weight decisively. Another decision point occurs when the encounter transitions from questioning to implied compulsion. The officer's stance, positioning, and tone suggest consequences for noncompliance, even if not verbally stated. Courts later examine whether a reasonable person would feel free to disengage. According to the footage, that freedom is steadily eroded. This decision removed another potential defense. Departmental context also includes training doctrine. Officers are trained that lawful authority must be demonstrable, not assumed. When authority is exercised without documentation, it creates downstream liability for the agency itself. The officer's actions now bind the department to the outcome. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not chosen. The silence from institutional actors becomes its own form of escalation. No supervisor intervenes. No corrective instruction is issued. The encounter proceeds unchecked. This absence will later be interpreted not as approval, but as missed opportunity. The system's involvement deepens even without direct participation. The camera's presence guarantees review. The footage will be cataloged, logged, and replayed. Each decision point will be isolated and examined. The officer's choices are no longer ephemeral. They are fixed. Another decision point follows when the officer declines to disengage despite the absence of new information. Prolongation without cause is not neutral. It compounds exposure. This was another chance to stop. It was not taken. By this stage, the department's role has shifted from prevention to consequence management. Once the encounter concludes, internal mechanisms will activate automatically. Supervisory review is triggered. Internal affairs assessment becomes mandatory. Legal counsel will eventually evaluate the footage against constitutional standards. None of that is visible yet. All of it is now inevitable. The officer's continued adherence to the initial demand, without adjustment or clarification, transforms a single questionable decision into a pattern. Patterns are easier to evaluate and harder to defend. The system does not require intent to assign responsibility. It requires record. The camera provides it. The professor's identity remains secondary to her conduct. She does not leverage status. She does not escalate. Her consistency sharpens the contrast. The department's exposure grows not because of who she is, but because of what continues to happen to her on camera. As this phase closes, the structure surrounding the officer has failed to intervene. The encounter has crossed from individual judgment into institutional liability. Every subsequent moment will be measured against what could have stopped it here. The system had options. The officer had options. The footage shows which ones were not taken. The escalation becomes visible not through confrontation, but through sequencing. Each movement follows the last without interruption, creating a chain that is easier to trace than to justify. The officer closes distance. The professor remains stationary. The camera captures the narrowing space between them as a physical fact, not an interpretation. In constitutional analysis, proximity matters. It signals control. The next decision point occurs when the officer shifts from conditional language to directive language. Requests become commands. The tone no longer invites compliance. It presumes obligation. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed. There is still no articulation of cause, no reference to a violation, no explanation that would anchor the demand to an observable fact. The footage records the absence clearly. This is not a question of what is said incorrectly. It is a question of what is not said at all. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not taken. The professor's response does not change. Her posture remains neutral. Her hands are visible. Her voice remains controlled. These details are not incidental. Courts later examine whether officer escalation corresponds to subject behavior. Here, the escalation occurs in a vacuum. This decision removed another lawful exit. Another decision point follows when the officer reiterates the demand without narrowing its scope. Repetition without clarification does not strengthen authority, it exposes its fragility. The camera captures the moment where insistence replaces justification. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed again. The setting amplifies the stakes. This is not a chaotic environment. There are no bystanders interfering. No competing threats divide attention. The encounter unfolds in a controlled space, making each choice more deliberate. In later review, this calm will matter. It removes arguments based on urgency or distraction. The officer's body language changes again. The stance widens. The positioning blocks potential movement. Even without explicit restraint, the implication is clear. A reasonable person would not feel free to leave. This transition is critical. It marks the shift from encounter to detention. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not chosen. Another decision point occurs when the officer declines to disengage despite the absence of escalation from the professor. Disengagement is a lawful option. It remains unused. Each second of continued enforcement without cause increases exposure. This was another chance to stop. It was not taken. The professor's consistency now functions as evidence. Her conduct provides a stable baseline against which the officer's actions are measured. There is no new information introduced that would justify the escalation. The footage shows only persistence on one side. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed further. The officer's commands now carry implied consequences. Even without verbal threat, the structure of the interaction suggests compulsion. Courts later assess whether compliance was voluntary or coerced. The camera captures enough to answer that question without commentary. Another decision point arrives when the officer chooses not to summon supervisory input even as the encounter hardens. This choice matters because it confirms ownership of the outcome. The system offers intervention pathways. They are not used. At this stage, reversal was still possible. It was not taken. The pace of the scene slows. Movements become smaller. Speech becomes more measured. The absence of sudden action creates tension of a different kind. It allows every detail to be seen. The camera does not cut away. The record remains uninterrupted. This slowing is not resolution. It is accumulation. Each quiet second adds weight to what will later be reviewed frame by frame. The officer's authority is now fully asserted without documented foundation. The professor's lawful posture remains unchanged. As this phase concludes, the encounter reaches a point where outcomes are no longer hypothetical. The footage has captured enough to support formal review. The escalation has completed its arc. What remains is evaluation. The camera continues to record. The environment is still. The next movement will not be physical. It will be institutional. The footage does not end when the interaction does. It pauses. The officer steps back. The professor does not move. The space between them widens slightly. No one speaks. The camera records the absence of sound. Breathing becomes audible. Hands lower. Posture shifts from confrontation to stillness. Time stretches without instruction or explanation. No commands are issued. No movement is corrected. No authority is asserted. The camera remains fixed. When motion resumes, it does so outside the frame. What happens next is not physical. It is procedural. The next phase begins with review. According to standard departmental process reflected in public records across multiple jurisdictions, footage from encounters involving disputed authority is flagged for supervisory assessment. That process does not rely on recollection. It relies on sequence. The camera provides it. The first evaluative layer is internal. Supervisors examine whether the demand for papers was supported by an articulable basis. The footage does not supply one. At this stage, interpretation begins to harden. What could have been explained on scene now has to be justified after the fact. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed again. Internal affairs review follows. This transition is procedural, not punitive. Investigators isolate decision points. They measure duration. They assess tone, distance, and command language. Each repeated demand without justification becomes a discrete data point. The absence of escalation by the professor simplifies analysis. The burden of explanation now rests entirely on the officer and the department. Another micro-reveal occurs when legal counsel becomes involved. Municipal attorneys do not ask whether authority was felt. They ask whether it was lawful. The footage is evaluated against constitutional standards governing detention and identification requests. No supplemental explanation can alter what the camera shows. At this stage, reversal was no longer possible. The timeline extends. According to court filings later associated with the case, the footage is requested, copied, and preserved. Dates are logged. Review memoranda are drafted. Some details of these internal steps are not publicly disclosed in official records. What is disclosed is the outcome of that process. The investigation moves from internal evaluation to civil exposure assessment. Attorneys calculate risk. They examine precedent. They measure how a jury is likely to interpret an unsupported demand made persistent through command. The number attached to that assessment is not immediate. It emerges gradually. Another micro-reveal follows when litigation is initiated. Filings reference the footage directly. Arguments are constructed around what the camera records and what it does not. The professor's conduct remains unchanged across every replay. The officer's decisions do not. As the case advances, the footage becomes central. It is replayed in deposition preparation. It is referenced in motions. Each frame reinforces the same sequence. No new justification appears. The record remains closed. The silence captured earlier now functions differently. It is no longer a pause in an encounter. It is a pause in defense. There is nothing left to contextualize. Only sequence remains. By the time resolution approaches, the system has exhausted its internal explanations. What remains is quantification. The lawsuit does not measure harm in abstract terms. It assigns a figure. According to the title of this case, that figure reaches $12.8 million. The camera did not record that number. It recorded the decisions that made it unavoidable. The legal consequences do not arrive as a single announcement. They accumulate through filings, assessments, and narrowed options. By the time the number becomes public, the outcome is no longer speculative. It is formalized. According to court records associated with the case, the lawsuit advances on a narrow set of facts anchored almost entirely to the footage. The claim does not rely on disputed testimony. It relies on sequence. When authority is asserted without articulated cause, and when that assertion persists on camera, the legal analysis simplifies. The standard becomes whether the detention was justified. The record answers that question without inference. Another decision point occurs outside the street encounter, but it carries equal weight. The city chooses how to respond. Early dismissal is considered and set aside. Motion practice proceeds. Each procedural step reflects a calculation. Whether the footage can be reframed in a way that restores a lawful basis for the demand. From this point forward, the legal margin narrowed again. Depositions follow. The footage is replayed. Timestamps are noted. Distances are measured. Tone is compared across moments. The professor's conduct remains consistent in every reference. That consistency removes variability. It reduces defense arguments to justification alone. At this stage, reversal was still theoretically possible. It was not achieved. The city's legal review shifts from defense to exposure management. This transition is not announced publicly. It appears in scheduling decisions, settlement discussions, and resource allocation. Some of these internal deliberations are not publicly disclosed in official records. What is disclosed is the endpoint. Another micro-reveal occurs when negotiations reach their ceiling. The number attached to resolution is no longer symbolic, it is precise. According to the title, the lawsuit concludes with a $12.8 million outcome in favor of the professor. The figure reflects assessed risk, not emotion. It accounts for likelihood of verdict, potential damages, and the strength of the evidentiary record. The court does not need to speculate about intent. It does not need to assign motive. The analysis rests on whether constitutional limits were crossed and whether harm flowed from that crossing. The footage supplies the answer. The persistence of the demand without lawful grounding becomes determinative. Another decision point closes the sequence when the city finalizes resolution rather than proceeding to trial. This choice acknowledges that the evidentiary posture cannot be materially improved. The record will not change. The camera has already spoken. The outcome reverberates beyond the parties. Budgetary adjustments are required. Reporting obligations are triggered. The settlement becomes part of the public ledger. It is cited, summarized, and compared. None of that alters the underlying cause. It documents consequence. What makes this phase decisive is its restraint. There is no editorializing. No character judgment is necessary. The law evaluates conduct. The record fixes it. The number quantifies it. The $12.8 million figure does not appear suddenly. It emerges as the final measure of a chain of decisions that began with a demand for papers and continued without correction. Each missed opportunity compounds into a total that cannot be negotiated downward without abandoning defense entirely. The legal process ends where it must, with a resolution grounded in evidence. The footage did not require interpretation to reach that point. It required only time. The aftermath does not unfold on camera. It unfolds in policy language, training revisions, and oversight mechanisms that rarely draw public attention. The footage has already done its work. What remains is institutional response. Following resolution, departments typically initiate internal review protocols to assess procedural failure points. While specific corrective measures in this case are not publicly disclosed in official records, the existence of a $12.8 million outcome ensures that the encounter does not remain isolated. Settlements of that scale trigger mandatory reporting, external scrutiny, and risk reassessment across multiple levels of administration. Training frameworks are revisited. Identification requests, detention thresholds, and articulation requirements are re-examined against constitutional standards. The footage becomes a reference point, not because of its drama, but because of its clarity. It shows what happens when authority is asserted without documentation and maintained without recalibration. The lesson does not require commentary. The sequence provides it. Oversight bodies also respond. Civil liability of this magnitude invites inquiry into supervision, escalation protocols, and early intervention systems. The question shifts from what happened to why it was allowed to continue. That inquiry does not assign motive, it assigns responsibility through structure. The encounter now exists as precedent within institutional memory. Not judicial precedent, but operational precedent. Supervisors reference it when discussing disengagement options. Legal advisors cite it when warning of exposure. Trainers incorporate its timeline into scenario analysis. Each use reinforces the same conclusion. Unsupported authority becomes indefensible authority once recorded. The professor's role in this phase remains unchanged. She does not become a symbol. She remains a participant whose lawful conduct was preserved on camera. The system adjusts around that record, not around narrative. What makes the outcome irreversible is not the amount alone. It is the impossibility of recontextualizing the footage. No later explanation alters what the camera captured. No policy statement retroactively supplies justification. The record stands. In that sense, the footage achieves something rare. It removes ambiguity. It converts a contested interaction into a fixed account. Once that happens, institutional response becomes a matter of alignment rather than debate. This is how systems change quietly, not through spectacle, but through consequence. A demand made without foundation becomes a data point. Repetition becomes a pattern. Pattern becomes liability. Liability forces revision. The camera did not escalate the situation. It documented it. That documentation made the outcome unavoidable.